Okay, everyone, our time has started here. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Sociophonetics session here at the 2021 Virtual LSA. My name is Mary Hudgens Henderson. I am moderating this session for the presenters. First, we have Christopher Mendoza from Florida International University presenting that S tiene tumbao, exploring the bilingual dimensions of S plus production in Miami Latinx drag.
Thank you very much, Mary. All right, let me just get situated here. Always a couple of shuffles that need to be made. All right. So buenos dias, West Coast. Buenas tardes, East Coast, or wherever you are, depending. My name is Chris Mendoza. I use he, they, or in Spanish, él y ella pronouns. I'm a master's student at Florida International University in Miami, Florida. And I'm excited to talk to you today about my sociophonetic and ethnographic project on the Miami Wynwood drag scene. I want to begin by talking first about my positionality as a researcher in relationship to the speakers in my study. I'm a queer Boricua and Cubanix, born and raised in Miami and Westchester, or as we say, Westcheste, or La Sabecera. And I feel as though it's important to voice these things in order to demonstrate that when attempting to control for something like the observer's paradox, especially using remote interviewing methods, which we'll talk about, I think it's somewhat mediated by when you're a part of the community and you know these queens, or if you're an outsider, even if admittedly there's a microphone and that does switch up the dynamic. So in addition to structured questions about topics that we'll discuss, tea was spilled, kikis were had, and I believe it resulted in ultimately more naturalistic speech data. So before diving into this specific project, I want to begin with a brief overview of S research as it relates to my framing of certain arguments, which I'm sure we'll hear more of and expand upon our understanding of S and gender perception and construction in the following talk by Chloe on bisexuality. So we start with Munson 2007, Campbell Kibler 2011, and Zimin 2013 in the perception literature that demonstrate that a fronted S with higher center of gravity and a more negative spectral skew, which are the two variables I focus in on in my analysis, are rated as more gay, more femme, less representative of heteronormative masculinity. Then with Miami, we have to take into context what is the literature on this gendered performance in S production and multilinguals, and in non-English speaking contexts, recognizing that much of this literature is on English speaking subjects or European languages more broadly. So Walker et al. 2014 in a perception study found that differences in word medial preconsonantal S, looking at lenition as a socio-indexical gradient, were not consistent amongst Latinx populations. Mexican women rated strong S as more heteronormative, opposite of both Puerto Rican men and women. But this study, again, wasn't on fronting. Additionally, Boyd, 2018, looks at French and German bilinguals, the other language being English for each group. And in France, it also doesn't seem that this fronting indexes this femme-coded association. So here we start to ask the question, how universal is fronted S and femness? And finally, most important to my project, how is fronted S mediated as performed by racialized bodies within the US context, specifically with Latinx drag queens in Miami? So finally, Farah et al. 2014 finds that a fronted S in Denmark does index femininity until it's juxtaposed with a racialized immigrant associated prosodic style. So to go back to Zimin 2013 for a second, the paper I mentioned earlier, it calls to linguists to see that most of this work has been on white speakers, right? And then finally, Calder and King, which is forthcoming in a variety of different ways, they start to unpack the intersection between Blackness and S production and gender, again, complicating what really does fronted S index in terms of gender. So laying out my current study, the ethnography is based within the Wynwood drag scene. Wynwood being a gentrified, arts-oriented neighborhood and historically what was a garments district. So there's an ongoing historical relationship to fashion in this space. But also it was Miami's Little San Juan and the Puerto Rican community, which I'm also a part of. So it's important to recognize the framing of what was this space and what is it now. Now, the drag scene here is markedly different from what you may see on South Beach, which I argue is oriented towards the tourist gaze or the white gaze, spelled G-A-Y-Z-E, so white gay people, and also gaze as an analytical concept. So I measured S tokens from sociolinguistic interviews with 4 drag queens from the scene, 2 Cuban, 2 Puerto Rican, and we talked about drag in Miami, bilingualism, heritage, aesthetic choices in their drag, and broader Miami topics. The interviews were conducted remotely using the podcasting software Zencastr at a 44.1 kilohertz sampling rate. The software enabled me to do the recordings with similar acoustic parameters to previous studies. And I also sent them a microphone to better facilitate a similar recording environment, which of course was accompanied by my elevator speech on being in a quiet space for phonetic studies. All S tokens were segmented at a 40 millisecond midpoint, bandpass filtered following Pedezza and Van Hoffig in 2014. And then I did a spectral moments analysis focusing in on those COG and spectral skew measurements, both in their English and Spanish S productions. So here quickly, I wanted to mention the S tokens in final position, as is common in Caribbean Spanish varieties, may sometimes weaken, be aspirated, there's lenition, right? So I only use tokens that I identified as articulated at an alveolar place to better facilitate the cross-linguistic acoustic comparison, since I was comparing both languages, but I'll expand upon that later. So what you're looking at here are the box plots of center of gravity values for 3,000 tokens from the 4 drag queens in English on the left and Spanish on the right. So we have Celia de Cielo in red, Dianelis in blue, Huchi Hialeah in green, and Tropicalia in purple. These are all pseudonyms, just so you know. And while this might not be as fabulous as lip liner, I know graphs are not everyone's cup of tea, I promise that the multiple regression analyses are still pretty sickening. But before we get there, I want to draw attention to the values presented. So queens Dianelis, Celia, and Tropicalia hover just below or around 6,000 hertz in their average COG values, which is well within Philipson 1999's proposed values for the typical masculine range up to 7,000 hertz. So comparing to Calder 2019, who did a study on COG values of S in drag queens of San Francisco, we saw that there was this femme extremity in their acoustic performance, often with averages well above this range. Here we only see Huchi Hialeah with averages above 9,000, but with no statistical outliers, ranging from 4,000 hertz to 13,000 hertz. So we'll zoom into what I propose Huchi is doing in terms of stance after we look at those sickening multiple regression analyses. Okay, so they all say table 1 because me and our studio are not the best of friends, but we're getting there. We're getting reacquainted. But let's start with the table on the left, which is the multiple linear regression for center of gravity, including syllable position in the model, language, English or Spanish, and then speaker effects. I actually did an ANOVA before running this model to ensure that speaker effects were worth explaining the variation that was happening. And as you can see, it was highly significant. And that first model at 8.1, so a really small p-value, well, yeah, not an ideal p-value. There also seems to be a slightly more fronted tokens of S in the Spanish data. However, overall, there is no syllable position effect when including both languages. So now looking at the middle table with the skewness results, there is a large effect for both languages for syllable position, and also generally a large effect for Spanish having a more negative spectral skew. So again, in terms of articulation, more fronted tokens. And the queens, for the most part, are different from each other. However, here in the second model, the reference being Celia de Cielo, which Dianelis patterns similarly to, which I'll explain multimodally through an analysis of their aesthetics and a particular racialized femme persona that's legible here in Miami, related to a retracted S. I propose that a retracted S in Miami is eliciting and producing a type of femness that is opposite to traditional heteronormative, and which I argue is a white femininity. And then finally, in the last model, I subsetted the English data because of the previous findings that found there was a high syllable position effect in English. And then you do see a larger effect when you subset the data just for English. Now I want to take the S tokens outside of the graphs and put them within specific discourse context, highlighting what Huchi Hialeah does in our interview with S, and what I think semiotically it represents in terms of gender, ethno-racial categorization, and Latina femininities. My first point in contextualizing that these analyses of sociophonetic variation, as Aga reminds us, should be studied cross-modally. I argue that drag is a discursive space, borrowing from how Juana Maria Rodriguez discusses how the queer and gendered aspects of Latinidad as a construct, which should be problematized, arise within discursive spaces such as sex chat rooms, nightlife venues, and here the drag scene of Miami. Next, the shifts in the sociophonetic variation, the acoustic measurements, should be viewed as a process of disidentification described by Munoz in Queer of Color performance studies. Now, Barrett 1999 from Linguistics talks about this without the term disidentifications and referencing polyphonous identity and the strategic employment of white women's speech style and African American English and Black American drag. However, I think we need to think beyond this as a practice of identity. Rather, disidentifications positions us to understand retraction and fronting of S, inspired by Munoz, as a reflection of managing and negotiating the historical trauma and systemic violence of being a queer Latinx person in the United States. Thinking about stance, and my final point, which we'll look at in context, retracted S becomes symbolic of the Wynwood scene, hairy drag, chongaliciousness, which we'll define, and fronted S references what I argue should be described as white feminists, not necessarily just feminine bodies, but also how race and whiteness are integrated into the perception of particular types of femininity embedded in styles with fronted S. In Miami, this is relevant to South Beach as a drag community, which serves that white gaze and white tourists, right? So now I'll read. On the right side of your screen, you have some of the transcripts from Hoochie Hialeah, where you have a more retracted S in comparison to their English average and their Spanish average. So I'll read in English and then in Spanish, and then I'll translate the Spanish. So the places on South Beach and the drag queens on South Beach, there was no place for us. Like we couldn't get gigs anywhere. So in this conversation more broadly, they were aligning themselves with the Wynwood queens in the sense that South Beach was the pageantry, the pageant queens that didn't necessarily accept the type of drag that was being done in Wynwood. And that's where you see these more retracted tokens. And then in Spanish, cuando yo soy en drag, cuando yo soy Hoochie, soy veloso, que es mi forma de, la idea que mucha gente tiene en su cabeza de género es bien blanco y negro. Yo vengo a romper eso. So to translate, when I'm in drag, when I'm Hoochie, I'm hairy. It's my way of, the idea that many people have of gender in their head is very black and white, and I come to disrupt that. And in this conversation, similarly describing the aesthetic differences that differentiate Wynwood drag from South Beach drag, and also this anti-normative stance towards what gender is supposed to be. So in the next slide, you have the more fronted tokens relevant to the average COG in English. I didn't do Spanish again, just for the sake of time. But in this slide, I want you to look at the context under which that fronted S emerges in Hoochie's production. So I could see people outside of the LGBT community look at me sometimes in drag. It's just not making sense. They're like, oh, you're beautiful, you're stunning. Some of my biggest inspirations are like, I think of 90s rich old white woman in the 90s, a depressed single housewife living in Miami, what my parents aspired for, but couldn't achieve. So here in alignment with white femininity and those particular aesthetics in their drag choices, even though they also do, in some aspects, do use some type of chonga drag as well. So here there's commentary about class, race, and also aesthetics. So the type of drag persona constructed by Hoochie. And then there's also this proximity to whiteness that class mobility in Miami is tied to, especially when discussing earlier majority white Cuban immigrant waves. We can discuss that later in the Q&A as well. So now I want to introduce you to chongas, but I will briefly preference this with the fact that this is a parody video, and I'm going to complicate it. So just take it for the aesthetics mostly.
Hey guys, we're the Chonga Girls. My name is Laura.
And my name is Mimi.
We're from Miami.
305 for life. A chonga is a gift from God.
A chonga is a girl who knows no boundaries.
A chonga is a girl who doesn't give a damn about what people think about her.
A chonga.
There's your brief idea. Also, you can notice that the automatic speech recognition is not very good at capturing Miami English, but that's an aside. All right, so how does the chonga persona relate to racialized feminine performance? And also, what do these S values have to do with it? So the queens with the lowest COG values, who also aesthetically most closely align with the lip liner, tight clothes, hoops of chongas, fall well within the mask range of what Flips in 1999 puts forth for S below 7,000 hertz. So that's Celia, Dianelis, and Tropicalia, across languages. So to contextualize this, it's important to understand the ways in which chongas are portrayed in the media and perceived in Miami. In Jillian Hernandez's new book, Aesthetics of Excess, she calls out media representations like the ones that we just saw on Awesomeness TV that present chongas as Latin cheap girls, whores, disorderly, ratchet, which stand in juxtaposition to the bourgeois idea of white Latinidad. Chonga embodiment gets relegated acoustically to the masculine range because to perform fronted S would be to perform white womanhood, what's constructed as the norm. Hernandez mentions that chongas engage in body crafting, and I propose that by extension, these Wynwood queens engage in broad body crafting cross-modally through the linguistic and the aesthetic to oppose efforts to discipline Latinx and Latina bodies, and again, romper, to break in English, the idea of normative gender rooted in whiteness. Now moving to a preliminary model of fractal recursion in Miami in the indexical field, instead of feminine-bodied and male-bodied, which we've seen in the previous literature as markers of S retraction or fronting, I use masc and femme as a way of differentiating who is allowed to occupy these categories in our society. So masc and a more retracted S referencing cis hetero men, normative masculinity, chonga drag, and by extension, the Wynwood scene. Fronted S, I argue, should be described as a feature of white femininity and proximity to it, including white gay men, white queer folks. In our context, looking at Huchi's disidentifications, South Beach gets implicated as having a close relationship in its proximity to taking up more normative white feminine styles that clash with the chongaliciousness of Wynwood. Tumbao, which you see on the bottom, pointing towards chonga going from the femme to the masc and a more retracted S, is a concept I'm proposing inspired by Celia Cruz's song, La Negra Tiene Tumbao. Tumbao referring to a type of swing or swagger that allows us to conceptualize this shift in the field to be shaped by processes of racialization. So when we consider how gender, class, femininity, masculinity, how these things get constructed, how does whiteness become the unmarked in those descriptions in the literature? Tumbao asks us to forefront how does a category like gender get co-constructed along with race? And then finally, let's consider the bilingual implications of the work, right? S in Caribbean Spanish operates in syllable final position in different ways in English, often undergoing a process of lenition. And while I excluded those tokens to allow for acoustic data of fricatives that were in the same place of articulation, it is interesting that fronting happens in both languages. And just as an aside, there were a lot of final tokens. I just excluded the one that did undergo some process of lenition. So this begs the question of Miami's unique environment of having such a large bilingual population. Why would S be produced so similarly in both English and Spanish? I turned to Peña's ethnography of gay Cuban Miami to discuss the sociophonetic variation as a reflection of how queer Cuban Americans and Puerto Rican Americans, or just Puerto Ricans, linguistically navigate and integrate their inherently transnational bilingual queer identities in a process she calls pajaration. And then just briefly, I'll mention a study from South Africa, Becker and Levon 2017, that found similar perceptual data in reference to gender and S in Afrikaans and English, and another language context situation with high levels of bilingualism. So these are my references. If you want to take a snapshot really quickly. A quick slide of acknowledgement to what I call my academic ancestors and angels, so the folks who have laid out the field of queer sociophonetics and all of the scholars at FIU. And of course, my Miami Wynwood Queens. And then that is my contact info. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christopher. We have about 10 minutes for discussion. Please put your questions into the chat box. And when you post a question, please identify yourself, your name, institution, and pronouns. And our presenters will respond vocally to your questions. And while you're typing out your questions, please remember that the Q&A is for thoughtful questioning and for drawing out new ahas, not for combat. Make sure the question is really a question, not a speech. Keep the question and answer short enough that others have a turn. Limit your follow-ups for the same reason. And a good type of question mentions something positive about the talk and then open up an illuminating different way of looking at things, such as data, ideas, etc. Thanks. Okay, so I see we have one in the Q&A from Kendall. The question is, such interesting work. I loved this talk. I'm wondering if in your data you found any significant differences between coda S production and other S in the utterance. I would be interested to know since these Caribbean dialects delete and aspirate coda S at such high levels.
Yeah, so I did include syllable position in the model, but as I mentioned, I didn't include those that did undergo some process of lenition because I knew that obviously would affect the COG, but for a different reason, because at that time I'm analyzing something closer to a glottal fricative and less an S. But when I included syllable position in the model, including all of those final tokens, it wasn't significant in Spanish. I didn't actually have the fourth regression on there for the sake of slide space, but it wasn't significant in terms of syllable position. But yeah, thank you for that question, because there is a lot of different things going on with Caribbean Spanish S's.
Okay, and Robin has a methods question. How complex was it to send microphones to the people you worked with?
It wasn't entirely complex. What I decided to do, and this is all kind of an innovative method that I came up with to be able to do my thesis on time, was go to the post office and do prepaid postage with a package where I would mail them a USB mic that I had found that would allow me for the proper frequencies to do this kind of work with fricatives. But it wasn't entirely difficult. They were really good about sending it back within a week's time. So I was able to do, the next week, another interview with a different queen. But I did know them. So I think there was a level of trust involved in that. If it was complete strangers, I think, it would be a little risky to send a more expensive microphone, but I tend to trust my community members, so.
Okay, great. And we have a question from Lauren Ha-Lu, she, her. Great talk, thank you. Sorry if I missed this, but what are the ages of the speakers and to what extent is age, either speaker or community age / time or both, important to the indexicalities you're looking at?
Yeah, so they were all between 19 and 26. So a similar age group, and they all perform in the same scene at the same venues. So I didn't include age as any type of variable between the queens because it was a pretty similar age group, and they perform in the same spaces. So I think that in terms of the indexicalities, perhaps in older generation Cuban Americans, some of these indexicalities wouldn't exist, especially when talking about things like the Chonga girls and these particular type of personae that are related to working class Latinx girls from neighborhoods like Hialeah in Miami. But I do think that if I were, the next phase of this project, which has already been designed, is to do a perception study. So I think age would factor a little bit more heavily into looking at these indexicalities for the broader Miami community.
And we have a question from Jeff, he, him. Very interesting and important work. In your interviews, were they strictly in English, then strictly in Spanish? If not, was there code switching involved? And any thoughts on how that might affect any of the study's outcomes?
Yes, so each interview was done in English or Spanish. As is natural in Miami, there was some code switching in each of the interviews, but for the majority, all of it was in English or in Spanish, and I only included tokens embedded within those particular languages. Yeah.
Okay. Salva Cayesano, he, him, UIUC. Fantastic talk. I am sorry if I missed this, but where in Miami do the queens live? In general, I'm wondering how neighborhood of residence versus work might be playing a role, since you noted the difference between Wynwood and South Beach.
Yeah. 3 of the queens live near Wynwood in Edgewater, so the adjacent community on the coast. One of the queens lives in Hialeah. And then one of the other queens was raised in Hialeah, but now they live in Wynwood. So 3 of them in the Edgewater area, 1 in Hialeah. One of them was raised in Hialeah. Well, 3 of the queens are raised in Hialeah. So those particular personae from Hialeah, I think, would be extremely relevant to them in terms of their exposure to the persona. But they all are members of the Wynwood scene in terms of all the performances take place at Wynwood venues. They don't perform in South Beach.
Okay, and we have a question from Deandra, MH, they, them. Wynwood are interpreted with respect to normative, i.e. white models of femininity. How do you think about the effects of ratio ethnicity as a broader construct and its relationship to drag and language, e.g. AAE, Boricua / New York Spanish in your study?
I'm processing, just give me a second. Right, yeah. So I think the beginning question to this project when I first contemplated how to do this study was thinking about all of this discourse around fronted S referencing some type of femininity, right? So the initial question was, who are the participants in these studies and how do those particular conclusions get made depending on who those participants are, and also the broader discourses about what it means to be gay and queer. And how does that factor into constructions of ratio ethnicity, right? So my kind of relationship to that is that Wynwood, looking at the queer of color theory and feminist theory on how chongas are perceived and the particular aesthetics that these drag queens take up, by using those particular aesthetics that are breaking the traditional molds of what we see about normative femininity indexed with whiteness as well, they're kind of breaking through those particular molds. So, and looking at the particular discourse context as well, we see differences in alignment. So whether aligning towards the Wynwood scene or aligning towards the South Beach scene, which are also negatively evaluating its orientation towards white tourists, I think that's where that distinction comes clear about how that feature changes depending on retraction versus fronting. But yeah, I'll have to sit with that and we can chat more about it too.
Okay, Dominique, she, her has a question. It's interesting to hear you talk about how fronted S interacts with types of racialized femininity. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on Black femme queerness. I've noticed a lot of S fronting, and I wonder if that'd be considered like performing some sort of white feminist, or maybe something else is happening.
Yeah, I think, mentioning that Barrett 1999 paper, I wish I had the acoustic data from those performances, right? Because Barrett talks about this process of polyphonous identity and, in specific context, utilizing a white women's speech style almost as a type of parody to make a commentary on what whiteness does to Black femmes in our society, right? While also using AAVE within the same performance. So I think the juxtaposition of those styles, I would like to see how S plays into that construction of alignment with either Black feminists or white feminists, and how perhaps this is something that different femme communities of color are doing, right? But I'd be interested to look at that kind of acoustic data for sure.
Okay, and Christopher, you have about 20 seconds left. Philip Carter has a question. Could you unpack this concept of tumbao once more and explain how you see it working with Munoz's disidentification?
Hi,
Okay,
Dr.
20 seconds.
Carter. I don't know if I can unpack Tumbao in 20 seconds, but more quickly, I think disidentification asks us to look at how racialization shapes different uses of style, right? So if you're using something that's considered the majoritarian affect, like fronted S, juxtaposed with a retracted S associated with this racialized Chonga persona, Tumbao asks us, how does just race factor into this understanding of gender, right? So it's not just that we're constructing gender as this separate abstract category, but it's co-constructed along with ratio-ethnic categories, right? So that's how I would define how Tumbao asks us to do that.
Okay, thank you, Christopher. And you have 2 more questions in the Q&A if later you would like to go back and type your response to those folks.
Sure, thank you very much.
Thank you thank you. And thank you to the audience. Next, we have Chloe Willis from the University of California, Santa Barbara, presenting bisexuality and S production.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today, and thank you for that amazing talk, Chris. Okay, let me just get set up here. Hi, everyone. My name is Chloe Willis. I'm a PhD student in the linguistics department at UC Santa Barbara. And today I'll be talking with you about my work on bisexuality and S production. For my master's thesis, I did an acoustic analysis of how bisexual English speakers produce the voiceless alveolar fricative S relative to lesbian, gay, and straight speakers at UC Santa Barbara. More specifically, I compared the acoustic profile of S tokens based on 3 measures: center of gravity, which is the weighted mean frequency; skew, which refers to how fast energy falls off as frequency increases; and duration. I also did a qualitative analysis of post-test surveys that asked participants about gender stereotypicality. Ultimately, I found that bisexual speakers do not consistently pattern with lesbian or gay speakers, straight speakers, or even with each other. I'll provide some more details about my methods, the findings, and their implications later in this talk, but first I'd like to provide some context for the whys of this study, starting with where this work fits into the broader language, gender, and sexuality literature. Rudolph Gaudio's influential 1994 work on the pitch properties of gay and straight men's speech inspired numerous similar sociophonetic studies investigating the acoustic correlates of queer-sounding voices. Many of these studies focus exclusively on gay men or sounding gay, whereas relatively few studies focus on lesbians or sounding lesbian. As far as I know, there are no sociophonetic studies that center bisexual speakers, though see Thorne for a sociocultural study. However, there are some studies of queer-sounding voices that include bisexual participants. When bisexual speakers are included in these studies, there are only usually a handful of them, and most of the time they're not treated as a separate category. All of this to say that while we know a lot about sexuality in the voice, we can't conclude that sexuality has acoustic correlates that go beyond ideologies of lesbian and gay versus straight difference at this point. So what does bisexuality bring to the table, you might be asking? Well, bisexuality makes important contributions to how the intersection between gender and sexuality is understood. Thinking about the structure of most sociophonetic studies of sexuality in the voice, participants are usually categorized as straight or queer, and results are interpreted as deviance from the straight norm. In other words, participants are positioned as normative or straight on the one hand, or as queer and non-normative on the other. When bisexual speakers are included in studies like this, they're usually grouped with lesbian and gay speakers a priori. However, this non-normative positioning does not necessarily reflect how bisexual people experience the intersection between gender normativity and sexuality in everyday life. Think about this. On the one hand, bisexual people in different gender relationships are often perceived as normative, both in terms of gender and sexuality. On the other hand, bisexuals in same gender relationships are typically not perceived as normative. And I want to acknowledge at this point that, of course, some bisexual people will be perceived as non-normative based on their gender presentation, regardless of the gender of their partner. The point here is that bisexuality troubles some of the underlying ideologies of gender, sexuality, and normativity that are left implicit in sociophonetic studies and of sexuality and the voice. Okay, so next I'd like to talk a little bit about why I chose S. There are many studies that have investigated other variables as potential correlates of sounding gay or sounding lesbian, the most thoroughly investigated of which is pitch or F0, though vowels and other fricatives like esh come to mind as well. Unfortunately, the results of these studies have been pretty inconsistent and sometimes even contradictory. However, analyses of S have produced results that are relatively consistent. For example, several studies have found that S is a particularly salient cue that listeners attend to when making judgments about sexuality in the North American English-speaking context. The production side is a little messier, but overall studies indicate that there's a correlation between S production and sexual orientation, especially for men. Multiple studies have found differences in how gay and straight men produce S in terms of S-frontedness, which is related to center of gravity, skew, and duration. The results for women are less consistent, but some studies have reported significant differences in terms of S-frontedness. In any case, out of all the variables I could have chosen, I had reason to believe that S was a good place to start. Okay, so now let's get into the actual study, starting with the participants. My participants were 27 students at UC Santa Barbara, a mix of undergrad and graduate students. Looking at the second column from the left, there were 5 participants in each group except for bisexual men. Only 2 eligible bisexual men participated. All of my participants identified as cisgender, were somewhere between 18 and 30 years old, as we can see in the third and fourth columns, and were native English speakers. Looking at the fifth column, most of the participants identified as white, but there was also strong Latinx and Asian representation, as well as a couple of folks who identified as mixed race. Looking at the rightmost column, the vast majority of participants identified somewhere in the US as their place of origin, with California being particularly well represented. But there were 2 participants who moved back and forth between the US and Europe throughout their childhood, and 1 participant who was born in India. Now for my methods. I used a Python script to extract word initial tokens of S from participants' first reading of the Rainbow Passage, which is a phonetically bound scientific passage about rainbows that's been used in other studies like this one. The tokens in strike and in friends say were discarded because of their phonological context. Disfluencies and tokens that I judged to contain periodicity were also discarded, leaving a mean of about 14 tokens per person, or 372 tokens total. During this process, I also manually checked measurements that seemed atypical. This applied to tokens in which the center of gravity was lower than 4,000 hertz or higher than 8,500 hertz, or tokens in which the skew was less than -2 or more than +2. Duration was also manually checked for each token when I looked for periodicity. Once the data was processed, I fit a linear mixed effects regression model for each dependent variable, center of gravity, skew, and duration, so 3 models, using the Elmer function from the Elmer test package in R. In these 3 models, speaker and word were included as random effects with varying intercepts. As for model selection, I used the drop1 function from the LME4 package to select for the model with the best fit. And then I used the ANOVA function from base R to determine the significance of the main effects. Finally, I did some post hoc pairwise comparisons with the relevel function in order to capture the differences between all 6 groups. The Bonferroni method was used to compensate for evaluating the models multiple times, up to 5 times in the case of the center of gravity model. Before I get into the statistical results, I want to clarify in advance why I will report both the Bonferroni corrected significance values as well as the uncorrected values. The first reason is a matter of convention. Adjustments like the Bonferroni correction are not used consistently in sociophonetic studies of sexuality in the voice, so it's not necessarily unusual to report unadjusted results. The second reason is a matter of the correction itself. The Bonferroni method is known for being intolerant of type 1 errors. So in other words, it can fail to detect true differences and is potentially overly conservative. Given these 2 points, I believe it's appropriate to report both sets of values, keeping in mind that the corrected ones are held to a more rigorous standard. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's talk about the center of gravity model first, starting with some descriptive statistics. On this slide, we have a scatter plot of center of gravity values by group on the left, starting with bisexual men, bisexual women, gay men, lesbian women, straight men, and then straight women. And then on the right here, we have a table with the mean center of gravity values by group, as well as the range for each group. In this study, straight women had the highest mean center of gravity with 8,163 hertz, and straight men had the lowest mean center of gravity with 6,597 hertz. These results are not surprising given the previous work on center of gravity and gender. Okay, so now let's talk about the center of gravity statistical model. The model selection process indicated that the model with gender, sexuality, and their interaction was the best fit. Gender and the interaction between gender and sexuality were both significant main effects. The fixed effects explained about 29% of the variance, and the random effects explained about 38% of the variance. The random effect speaker explained 6.6 times more variance than the random effect word. Okay, comparing across sexuality but within gender, so looking at this top table here, I found significant differences between bisexual women and lesbian women before and after the correction, such that bisexual women produce a fronter S with higher center of gravity compared to lesbian women. I also found significant differences between lesbian women and straight women before and after the correction, such that lesbian women produce a backer S with lower center of gravity. As for the within sexuality cross-gender comparisons, which are in this bottom table, I found significant differences between bisexual women and men, such that bisexual women produce a fronter S with higher center of gravity, but the significance of this difference was lost after the correction. The differences between straight women and straight men, however, maintained before and after the correction. Okay, for skew, however, the modeling process took a rather unexpected turn. The model selection process indicated that neither gender, sexuality, nor their interaction contributed to the overall fit of the model. The random effects explained about 58% of the variance in the data, with speaker explaining a whopping 43 times more variance than word. The results, or lack of results rather, is rather surprising, given that previous studies, such as the work by Munson and colleagues, have found pretty robust differences in skew between gay and straight men. I posit two plausible examples, or explanations, for this unexpected result. The first has to do with the statistical methods. Over the years, quite a few modeling approaches have been used in studies like this, MANOVA, ANOVA, and linear mixed effects regression, to name a few. So perhaps it's unsurprising that the results are inconsistent. The second explanation has to do with intersectionality. Considering that speaker is the vastly more important of the two random effects, it's possible that the influence of some other axis of identity that is embedded within speaker, such as race or regional affiliation, is the key element here. I'll return to the importance of intersectionality later on in this talk, but suffice to say for now that more work on the intersection between gender, sexuality, and other axes of identity in relation to X production is needed. The results for duration, on the other hand, were much clearer. The model selection process indicated that the model with just sexuality was the best fit, and that sexuality was a significant main effect. Bisexual speakers produced S with the shortest duration, followed by lesbian and gay speakers in the middle, and then straight speakers with the longest S. The fixed effects accounted for about 24% of the variance, and the random effects accounted for about 45% of the variance. In this case, word accounted for 3.5 more variance than speaker. Okay, there were significant differences in the duration of S between all three groups before and after the Bonferroni correction. These findings were quite robust. The model itself had the highest chi-squared value of all of the models, and the p-values for the pairwise comparisons were very small, as you can see in this table at the top of the slide. As for possible confounds, I compared a model using token instead of word as a random effect to investigate whether token position within the passage could be exerting a strong influence over the results, but I found no significant difference between the reported model, which uses word, and a model that uses token. However, I did not control for global speech rate, which may have had an effect on these results. Okay, so now to summarize the most important results. For center of gravity, I found that bisexual women produced a significantly fronter S relative to lesbian women both before and after the correction. I also found that bisexual women produce a fronter S than bisexual men, but this finding was no longer significant after the correction. The model selection process did not work out as expected for skew, as the random effect speaker explained most of the variation. But for duration, I found that bisexual speakers produce significantly shorter S's than everyone else in this study, though the results could be confounded by global speech rate. So those are the statistical results. Next, I'd like to talk about my qualitative analysis of post-test participant information surveys. Okay, the post-test survey asked participants 3 questions. What genders are you attracted to? How stereotypically feminine do you consider yourself? And how stereotypically masculine do you consider yourself? I'm just going to talk about the second and third questions today. Participants answered these questions by selecting a number on a Likert scale in which 1 meant not at all stereotypically feminine or masculine, depending on the question, and 7 meant very stereotypically feminine or very stereotypically masculine. All but 1 participant provided ratings on both of the scales. At this point, you might be wondering why this data wasn't in the statistical models. The models would not converge after adding 2 7-level ordinal variables, so I chose to do an entirely qualitative analysis of the survey responses instead. In any case, I found that the straight participants, who are the bottom 2 rows of this table, often rated themselves towards the more extreme ends of the scales, in line with normative expectations for their gender. All of the straight women rated themselves as more feminine than masculine, and all of the straight men rated themselves as more masculine than feminine. Lesbian women and gay men, however, rated themselves more towards the middle of the scale for both measures, and did not systematically rate themselves as more feminine or more masculine by group. As for the bisexual participants, the 2 bisexual men who participated in this study provided exactly opposite ratings, 1 man rating himself as more feminine than masculine, and the other man rating himself as more masculine than feminine. Most of the bisexual women rated themselves as more feminine, so between a 5 and a 6, and masculine, somewhere between a 1 and a 2. However, 1 bisexual woman rated herself as more masculine than feminine. I'm going to tentatively suggest here that the bisexual men in this study rated themselves in a way that seems more similar to the gay men, based on how, 1, neither bisexual men nor gay men consistently rated themselves as more feminine or more masculine, and how, 2, their ratings were on the less extreme ends of the scale. On the other hand, for the most part, bisexual women's ratings seemed more similar to the straight women's ratings, in that 4 out of 5 of them identified as more feminine than masculine, with just 1 exception, and that most of their ratings were on the more extreme ends of the spectrum. So what does all of this mean? Given what we know from intersectionality theory, we can assume that the different axes of identity, such as gender and sexuality, for example, interact in inextricable, non-additive ways. The gender stereotypicality ratings participants provided suggest that bisexual women and men in this study oriented gender normativity and by extension its intersection with sexuality in distinct ways. The observations gleaned from these ratings fit in well with the results of the statistical analysis, in which bisexual women and men did not consistently pattern with each other nor any other group. Furthermore, as I suggested earlier, we might look to intersectional approaches to help explain why the results for skew in the study did not play out as expected. This work makes 4 major contributions to the study of sexuality in the voice. First, the statistical results suggest that more work on duration is needed. Duration is relatively understudied in relation to gender and sexuality compared to something like center of gravity or skew. But the duration model reported here had the most robust results. Second, the results of the statistical analysis and the qualitative analysis indicate that bisexuals do not pattern systematically with lesbian or gay speakers, calling the practice of grouping bisexual speakers with lesbian and gay speakers a priori into question. Next, the bisexual speakers in the study did not systematically pattern even among themselves for all of the statistical variables or in the qualitative analysis. Taken together, these findings suggest that future sociophonetic studies of sexuality in the voice must closely attend to the role of ideology, normativity, and intersectionality. Explicitly addressing these phenomena will not only provide a stronger theoretical grounding when interpreting results, but will also make the implications and assumptions of the methods that we use more transparent. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much. We have about 9 minutes for questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A box. The LSA said to do it in the chat box, but the QSA is a bit easier, although I would mention any questions that end up in the chat box. When you post a question, please identify yourself, your name, institution, and pronouns, and our presenter will respond vocally to your questions. Okay, and we have a question from Emily Ramirez, she, her, from UC Berkeley. This is awesome and important work. I'm curious if you have any predictions or would consider testing things like gender of any partner and whether they spend more time or feel more integrated in majority straight versus majority queer spaces.
Hi, Emily. Thank you for your question. Yes, I absolutely would consider testing these kind of things. I think kind of the natural next step for this project is to do something that has a stronger ethnographic grounding so that I can have the time to ask questions like these and start building these as factors into the statistical model. Because yes, I do suspect that things like the gender of folks' partners, whether or not they feel more comfortable in straight versus queer spaces, and also things like gender presentation. And as Chris discussed in their talk, the kind of interplay between gender and sexuality and other axes of their identity, like ethnicity or race and place of origin are all important factors. So yes, definitely.
Okay, great. Erin, she, her, University of Rochester, great talk. I was wondering if the lesbian, gay, bisexual participants were all publicly out, and if not, how you think this might have affected their performance of their sexuality in their speech.
That's a great question. Actually, so to be kind of transparent, some of the participants I knew on, we were friends or acquaintances, whereas other participants I was not familiar with. So I'm actually not sure for every single person as whether or not they were openly out. So unfortunately, I can't answer that question, but I do suspect that of course would too play a role, kind of tying into the last question that was just asked. So yeah, both of these questions kind of indicate that an ethnographic follow-up is really the way to go here.
Great. Joel Tillman, he, him, not affiliated. How were you able to find participants for the study? Were these people you knew or found elsewhere?
So I advertised the study through various channels. So the Resource Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity on campus, also among various linguistic classes and amongst people in my community. So I was able to find participants that way. I only reported the results for 27 people here, but I actually recorded about 70 different talkers through this kind of process.
Okay, Adrian, he, him, you, Chicago. I noted that all your participants were cisgender. I'm curious if you have any hypotheses on how your data might vary with transgender or non-binary populations, given your qualitative gender-based observations. Very important work. Thank you for doing this.
That's a great question. Thank you for that question. I will say that I don't necessarily have strong hypotheses right now. To be honest, going into this project, I didn't really know what to expect because there is very little to no work that centers bisexual speakers in this way. However, I do think that things like gender presentation or rather a distinction between gender presentation and gender identity would be useful to look at in future studies. And yeah, I am very curious as to how non-binary speakers would factor into a study like this. So that's a natural feature extension as well.
Okay, now we have a question from Anna, she, they, OSU. Really cool presentation. I was wondering if you considered intersex or non-binary gender identities in your comparisons of femininity and masculinity with sexuality.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't hear you.
Yeah, sure. I was wondering if you considered intersex or non-binary gender identities in your comparisons of femininity and masculinity with sexuality.
In this particular study, I did not, as all of the participants identified as cisgender. But in future iterations of this work, I do have plans to include people who do not identify as cisgender. So yes, there will be a follow-up on that point.
Okay, and we have a question from Ander Beristain, he, him, from UIUC. Thanks for a super interesting talk. I'm sorry if I missed this, but did all speakers produce the same target tokens or was it natural speech? I'm asking this because previous literature has shown that anteriority and posteriority of neighboring vowels can affect COG values.
Great question. So yes, all speakers produced the same tokens. They were reading from the same scientific passage, the Rainbow Passage. So in that way, token was controlled for. And to be clear, the tokens that I was working with were all word initial tokens of S.
Okay, we have about 2.5 minutes left.
Okay.
We have a question from Lauren Hall-Lu, she, her, University of Edinburgh. I think the duration results are super interesting, and I personally wouldn't much about the possible rate of speech issue. Maybe I wouldn't worry much unless you happened to notice the bisexual group speaking especially fast, because the rate of speech effects are partially taken care of with speaker as random effect in the model. So if we do accept the duration results as reliable, what do you make of the bisexual short duration pattern?
That's a great question. I think to really answer that, I'll have to look to work like Chris's work that was just presented, because I do suspect that there is something going on with the intersection between gender, sexuality, and racial or ethnic identity in these cases. But I will say that this study was intended to mostly just be exploratory and to establish some point of reference. I intend to continue with this topic throughout my academic career. I've kind of made it my MO to study bisexual folks. So I'd love to follow up with you independently via email or something to talk about that in more depth.
Okay, we have about 1 more minute left. Paul Reed, Alabama, he, him. Really cool talk and well done. I know I missed this. My dog was going berserk at the beginning of the talk. Where were the participants from? Were they all from the same or similar regions?
So they were not all from the same or similar regions. So almost all of the participants identified somewhere in the US as their place of origin, with California being particularly well represented, but other states like Texas, Oregon, Illinois were also represented, and a few others. There were quite a few folks who moved around a lot, it seems, in their childhood. So they identified multiple places in the US. And there were also 2 participants who moved back and forth between the US and Europe throughout their childhood, and 1 participant who was born in India. So they were not all from the same place, excuse me. And I suspect that's why speaker, the random effects speaker, had such a strong effect in many of these models, is because all of that kind of information, right? So age, regional affiliation, race and ethnicity is kind of embedded into that single variable. So it was doing a lot of work in these models.
Thank you so much. And Chloe, you have a couple more questions in the Q&A. Perhaps you can answer as we go on to the next presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Finally, we have Iris Chow and Sang-Im Lee Kim of National Chiao Tung University presenting phonetic accommodation during spontaneous imitation by sibilant mergers in Taiwan Mandarin.
Thanks for the introduction. Just so you know, we are joining from Taiwan. So it's time. The time is now 2 a.m. So we prepared for the pre-recorded presentation. I hope you understand that. Let me share the screen. Is it good? Right.
Hello everyone, we're Iris and Sang-Im from National Chiao Tung University in Taiwan. Today we will talk about phonetic accommodation during spontaneous imitation by speakers of the sibilant merger in Taiwan Mandarin. Spontaneous imitation refers to subconscious changes in production toward a model talker. Previous studies have found that speakers could accommodate acoustic characteristics of the model talker, for example, vowel quality and F0. Also, some studies have shown that phonological structure could be imitated, such as the imitation of pre-voicing of voice stops and the extension of VOT accommodation to novel categories. Furthermore, social factors may modulate the degree of imitation. Babel et al. Have found that merged speakers could be less merged in a positive social context. New Zealanders tend to merge the vowels in the square near lexical set. However, they showed a decreased mergedness when exposed to an Australian model talker who was described as holding positive views of New Zealand. So social preference influences the degree of imitation and the degree of mergedness, which leads to our topic. Spontaneous imitation by speakers of the sibilant merger in Taiwan Mandarin in different social contexts. Let me first give you some background of the linguistic situation in Taiwan. Taiwan is a small island located near mainland China, and the capital city is Taipei. And TM is an official and dominant language on the island. The distinction between Taiwan Mandarin and Standard Mandarin spoken on the mainland is that Taiwanese Mandarin is perceived as being more refined and soft. It is received largely positively, but is not necessarily viewed as normative. What does it mean by non-normative aspects of Taiwan Mandarin? Taiwan Mandarin has many phonetic variants different from those in Standard Mandarin. For example, alveolar and retroflex sibilants are often merged through retroflexion, due to language contact with Taiwanese Southern Ming, which does not have the retroflex category in the system. And here is a Mandarin word. First one,
沙发沙发
the standard pronunciation, and the second one,
沙发沙发
the deretroflexed pronunciation. Also, TM is known for tone 3 reduction, which lacks concave F0 contour. Here is the tone 3 of standard Mandarin.
编写，编写，
And here is the typical tone 3 of Taiwan Mandarin.
先写，先写。
These two features are acoustically salient, and speakers of the two regions consider them as most salient dialectal distinguishing features. Traditionally, elderly, the sibilant merger is known to be conditioned by many social factors. For example, those who are from TSM family background would implement the merger more than others without TSM background. Also, this feature is somewhat stigmatized, especially for older people. This feature used to indicate low education. We began this project with two goals. First, we aim to examine the distribution of the sibilant merger among young TM speakers. And then we would like to establish the conditions in which social context could influence phonetic imitation by speakers with varying degrees of the sibilant merger. And the experiments included a rat speech and a spontaneous imitation task. There were 61 TM-speaking college students balanced for gender and TSM fluency. Stimuli included disyllabic Mandarin words beginning with alveolars and retroflexes. For the acoustic analysis, spectral means of frication noise was measured using a multi-taper spectral analysis. We computed the spectral distance between the two sibilants and selected speakers with a complete merger using Bayesian t-test. We also computed PILA scores, which were highly correlated with spectral distance. This is a box plot of the spectral means of 29 male speakers. The two small boxes next to each other are spectral means of alveolar and retroflexes of one speaker. And different colors represent TSM fluency. Red stands for TSM fluent speakers, and blue stands for monolingual TM speakers. The bottom panel shows the spectral distance of the two sibilants for each individual speaker. This line is marking spectral distance of 0, meaning that the two categories makes no differences in spectral mean values. The results show that sibilant contrast ranges from a complete merger to clear contrasts. Here are some sample spectra of one speaker from one end. For this speaker, all the spectral estimates are sitting on top of each other, indicating that there is only one category. Another person from the other end makes clear contrasts between the two sibilants. Among 29 male speakers, 12 speakers were shown to be speakers of a complete merger. Importantly, among the speakers of the merger, 6 out of 12 don't speak TSM, which suggests that TM speakers implement the merger without direct contact with TSM, suggesting that this feature is becoming independent of TSM. For the following imitation study, we recruited two groups of the speakers, one from complete merger and the other from clear contrasts, who made sufficiently large spectral distance. Based on the rat speech data, we had 13 merged and 14 contrast speakers for the imitation task. The talker is a male speaker of standard Mandarin with clear sibilant distinction. The target items were 18 disyllabic words with initial sibilants, including both retroflex and alveolar sibilants. For example, 山脚 and 四亿. The control items were 7 words with tone 3 on the second syllable. For example, 编写. This conditions was included to examine the baseline performance between the two groups of the speakers. For the imitation task, participants were divided into either positive or negative conditions randomly. In the positive condition, we gave a positive description of the talker like, the talker loves Taiwan. He feels that the Taiwanese people are very enthusiastic and genuine, and their speech is polite and quiet. He decided to work in Taiwan after graduating from college and plans to settle in Taiwan in the future. In a negative condition, we gave a reversed narrative. We described he felt that Taiwan was very backward, he doesn't like Taiwan. He felt that Taiwanese speech is unclear and too soft, and they are not straightforward enough. He doesn't like Taiwan's culture and will return to China to work after graduating from college. Before the imitation task, participants completed a short rest speech task. The target items were 7 words with tone 3 on the second syllable, and they were used to compare with the control tone 3 items in the imitation task. For the imitation task, participants were asked to repeat the target words once immediately after the 2 repetitions of the word by the talker. The analysis of the frication noise of the sibilants remained the same with those in the rest speech, and the tone 3 syllable durations were measured in prot. We performed mixed effects regression for the statistical analysis. After the imitation task, there was a post-experiment survey, which was constructed to examine whether participants have established social preferences according to the experiment condition. There were largely 2 categories rated in the Likert scale from 1 to 5. In the first category, the questions included the impression of the talker. For example, do you like the accent of the talker? And do you think the talker is kind? The second category is questions about both the talker and mainland, such as if the talker recommends Chinese TV programs, would you be willing to watch? And if the talker can use only WeChat in China and he wants to get in touch with you through WeChat, would you be willing to install and use this app? Here are the results of sibilant imitation. The results of the contrast group are on the left, and those of the merged group are on the right. The red circles represent the spectrum means of the alveolar sibilants, and the blue represents those of the retroflex sibilants. In this figure, the results of the red speech is plotted on the leftmost side of each panel. The results show that contrast speakers have clear distinctions between the 2 sibilants, while merged speakers merge the contrasts. That's exactly how they were chosen as different groups. The talker's sibilant production is also plotted on the rightmost of each panel as a reference. The sibilant distinction by this talker is very clear. The spectral distance was about 6,000 Hz. The results of the imitation are plotted in the middle, with different social conditions, negative versus positive. The results show that both groups imitated the talker and enhanced the contrasts. And contrast speakers responded to the social conditions. The enhancement was larger in the positive condition than in the negative condition. And merged speakers were not systematically affected by the social condition. The enhancement was similar across 2 conditions. A possible account for the lack of the social conditioning for the merged speakers would be that they are unable to produce strong retroflexes by definition. But if we look at the data of the contrast group carefully, they imitated the talker more in the positive condition primarily by strong dentalization of the alveolars, but not so much by greater retroflexion. In contrast, merged speakers did not apply dentalization of the alveolar in the positive condition when they presumably can. This suggests that the lack of social conditioning is not due to the articulatory limitations, but the merged speakers chose not to imitate more after the model talker. Here are the results of tone 3 imitation. The tone 3 production of the talker was plotted on the right-hand side as a reference. Here is the tone 3 production of the talker.
编写
It's very long, about 600 milliseconds. And here are example tone 3 tokens from the contrast speakers.
先写
And here is an example from the merged speakers.
先写
Tone 3 duration in the baseline red speech was significantly longer for the contrast group. The result of tone 3 imitation revealed some unexpected findings. There was little enhancement during imitation for the contrast group, while tone 3 imitation was evident for the merged group. Here are the results of the survey. The top panel represents the preference for the talker-related properties. On the left-hand side, the contrast group shows that they have higher scores in the positive condition than in the negative condition, indicating they were influenced by social conditions as provided in the experiment. On the right-hand side, the merged group showed the comparable scores between positive and negative conditions, suggesting they were not influenced much by the social conditions in the experiment. The panel on the bottom represents the category of the questions about both the talker and the Mandarin combined. For example, a willingness to have a trip to Beijing with the talker. Focusing on the merged group, the scores in the positive condition were conversely lower than those in the negative condition, which is quite unexpected. We take this to mean that some of the merged speakers may have feelings against the Mandarin to begin with, and are not willing to accept values against it. Here is the summary of the findings of the imitation study. Both groups enhanced sibling contrasts toward the model talker. However, social conditions modulated the degree of imitation for the contrast group, but not for the merged group. As for the tone 3 production, there were some unexpected findings. Merged speakers reduced tone 3 more than contrast speakers in the baseline rest speech. During imitation, contrast speakers did not enhance tone 3 duration after the model talker, and hence no social conditioning effects. However, tone 3 imitation was evident for the merged speakers, while they still did not respond to the social condition. To continue our discussion about some peculiar findings of the study, we found that contrast speakers show selective imitation of phonetic features. They imitated the sibilants after the model talker, but not for tone 3. We speculated that contrast speakers produced longer tone 3 in the baseline rest speech, which may have been their maximum for tone 3 duration. In other words, excessively long and concave F0 as in full tone 3 may be outside TM speakers' phonetic repertoire, and they choose not to go that far. As for the merged speakers, the performance of sibilant and tone 3 imitation were consistent. They did imitate in the direction of the model talker for the two phonetic variables, but did not respond to the social conditions provided in the experiment. The remaining question is why the merged speakers did not respond to the social conditions in the experiments. Who are the merged speakers? Here are the summaries of the findings of all the experiments. They sound Taiwanese local. They merged the sibilants, but many of them do not speak TSM, and they don't mind the social stigma associated with this variant. Tone 3 is reduced by merged speakers more than contrast speakers. Recall that tone 3 reduction is a characteristic feature of Taiwan Mandarin, distinct from standard Mandarin spoken in the mainland. However, merged speakers could implement standard pronunciation under certain circumstances. They can unmerge the sibilant merger and lengthen the reduced tone 3 as shown in spontaneous imitation, suggesting that they chose not to. Moreover, they are proud of being Taiwanese. The survey further revealed their strong positive orientation toward Taiwan. Taken together, it seems that the sibilant merger, once a substrate feature, may have been reinterpreted as a symbol of Taiwanese identity by young TM speakers, and they refused to accept values against their identity. The merged speakers' linguistic behavior is consistent with the social hysterical changes in the society. That is, there is certainly a rise of Taiwanese identity in the region, and linguistic change follows along. Recent social linguistic studies have reported the changes in the attitudes toward TSM-accented Taiwan Mandarin. The dominant language for the older generation was TSM, but the use of Southern Ming was banned and the Mandarin Chinese was promoted as an official language since 1949. So many middle-aged Taiwanese have negative feelings about TSM-accented Mandarin. However, this negative association of TSM-accented Taiwan Mandarin is disappearing gradually among the younger generation, and they began to embrace their Taiwanese culture and tradition in a positive light. This is not an isolated phenomenon. For example, the so-called recycling in Cajun English has been noted in the literature. Cajun English was influenced by French, such as heavy nasalization, monophonization of the diphthong, and the th stopping of the interdental fructus. For the middle-aged Cajun, they were aware of the stigma attached to Cajun English. However, there is a rise of Cajun-style English among the younger generation along with Cajun cultural renaissance in Louisiana. In conclusion, we found that speakers of the merger can emerge during spontaneous imitation, consistent with previous studies. However, social conditioning in spontaneous imitation is not unconditional. It is sensitive to the type of the merger. When the merger carries some social meaning, it may interact with experimental conditions, and additional information may not work. In terms of methodological concerns, we have learned that spontaneous imitation is quite versatile as an experimental paradigm, through which we could observe speakers' social orientations as well as linguistic structures. And that's all for our presentation. Thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you so much. We have about 9 minutes for discussion. Please put your questions into the Q&A box. When you post a question, please identify yourself, your name, institution, and pronouns. Our presenters will respond vocally to your questions. Okay, so we'll take a look at Joel Tillman, he, him, not affiliated. Are most of the tone distinctions of TM perceptible to the speaker compared to a standard dialect? It sounds like they are mutually intelligible, but you highlight the T3 you record.
The tone 3 is for the standard Mandarin is very long, and the tone 3 for the Taiwan Mandarin is reduced and produced shorter than tone 2. So these the tone 3, this feature is salient for the 2 region, but not for the tone 1 and the other tones.
Just to add a little bit more to that, standard Mandarin spoken in the mainland and Taiwan Mandarin are just dialects. Of course, they're mutually intelligible. And then in terms of the tone, the main difference is found in the tone 3 production. It's been well noted in the literature that such that tone 3 in Taiwan Mandarin is much shorter than the one in standard Mandarin. And then I just heard from one of my colleagues that it's getting shorter for the younger generation. So a long time ago, it was kind of longer, but it gets shorter and shorter. I don't know if that's the case, but it seems to be it's very salient. Once you hear, then you would know that this person is from China or not. It's that salient. I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
Okay, Yian Jason Chen, he, him, Indiana University, Bloomington. Thank you for the very interesting talk. I'm wondering how TSM fluency was assessed. Was it self-reporting?
The TSM fluency was self-reporting by the survey, and they do the survey first, and then they will do the RAS speech, and then after knowing their mergeness status, we will move on to the imitation task.
Okay, thank you. CJ, he, him, you, CSB. Hi, Iris and Sang Im. Really interesting work, and I'm happy to see other scholars from Taiwan here at LSA. I have 2 questions. One, did you notice any examples of hypercorrection in the contrast speakers, i.e. producing the retroflex sibilant when the correct pronunciation would be alveolar sibilants? And number 2, did you collect any data about where the participants were from, e.g. north versus south, other areas? If not, do you think there might be a difference?
I have to process first.
Okay, I can take that. So hypercorrection is well noted in the literature. There's a paper by Chow in 2006 saying that some people wants to show that they can produce retroflexes well, because a long time ago, if you can't produce retroflexes, you look uneducated and it's socially stigmatized. So in formal setting, people tend to hypercorrect, and then sometimes they do even hypercorrection. Hypercorrect the correctly produced retroflexes. They replace correctly produced retroflexes with the eyeless, sorry, the other way around. But then in this case, because it's a spontaneous imitation, so you would hear a sound produced by the model talker and you would repeat after. So it's we didn't see hypercorrection in this case, but it's noted in the literature. Another question about the region. We did a very, very thorough language background survey. We asked about where they're from, what language they use at home, and everything. And the thing is that, if you know Taiwan a little bit, North Taiwan Mandarin is spoken heavily, and in the South, people use Taiwanese Southern Min. But we balanced them, not based on their region, but based on their Taiwanese Southern Min fluency, which actually tells you, basically it aligns well with the region. So if you are Taiwanese Southern Min fluent, then you're most likely from the South, and vice versa. So that's kind of half and half. It's well balanced and experiment.
Okay, Maddie has a question. Sorry if I missed this. Were the people chosen for the perception experiment merged contrast for the sibilants the same as those categorized as merged contrast for tone 3? It would strike me as odd if being merged in sibilants corresponded exactly with tone 3 reduction, since the processes don't seem to be very related phonologically.
Can I answer the question? So tone 3 was just added to establish that the two groups of speakers are just the same in terms of the ability of imitating other people. So we know that the two processes are just completely irrelevant from each other. And merged speakers and contrast speakers, they would both be able to, we thought that they would be able to imitate the tone 3 produced by the model talker equally. So that we can confirm that both groups of speakers can imitate other people well. That's actually one of the conditions where you can do, when you do the between subject experiment, you need to make sure that two groups of speakers are not that different in terms of the quality of the imitation ability. But then it suddenly that was like an unexpected finding that, we didn't know that the two groups would be different from each other. But then later on, we gave a thought, and it seems that it's well aligning with the idea that the merged speakers are more like, they sound more like Taiwanese style. They speak like more Taiwanese non-enunciating Mandarin, so they reduce everything. They reduce retroflexion, they reduce tone 3, and therefore they sound more like Taiwanese local. That's a postdoc speculation about what seems to have happened. It's a good point. But the initial idea is that we just wanted to confirm that the two groups of speakers are not different on that. But it turns out they're different, yeah.
We have about a minute and a half left. Let's take a question from Regina Ndochi. She heard the Ohio State University. Thank you. This is a very interesting study. I was curious to hear your thoughts on the standard imitations of the merged speakers and the extent this is related to bidialectalism, if that is the correct term to use in this case.
I'm not sure what it means by bidialectalism. Does it mean that the speakers would speak both Taiwan Mandarin and TSM, Taiwanese Southern Min?
Yes.
I think it's like, yeah, if that's so. Well, first of all, the two are more like languages, two different languages. They have very different sound systems. They're not mutually intelligible. Well, I can tell you one thing. So there was a paper. So previously, a long time ago, people have long believed that the reason that you get the retroflexion is because you speak TSM. TSM doesn't have the retroflexes in the inventory, so you cannot produce retroflexes. Therefore, you would merge them together. But then the younger speakers all speak Taiwan Mandarin, and they don't really speak TSM that well. But even though you're good at TSM among the young speakers, it doesn't matter. So the impact of TSM on the Taiwan Mandarin, the merging of the siblings is turned out to be insignificant, especially among the young people. If you test older people, there might be huge correlation, and the TSM fluency might be a good predictor of whether you would merge the contrast or not. But among the young people, it doesn't seem to be the case. And our data also show that TSM is not a predictor of whether you would merge the contrasts. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And we are out of time now. If you would like to stay for a couple minutes, the PSAP people will leave our room open for a couple minutes for questions. Thank you so much to the presenters, and thank you everyone for attending. Sang, Im, and Iris, you do have another question here from Lauren Hall Liu, Sheher University of Edinburgh. Thank you for giving your talk in the middle of the night. The positive negative effect on the alveolar variant of the contrast speakers is so interesting. Does it imply that contrast speakers may be resisting imitation in the negative condition as a kind of classic act of identity by phonetic divergence?
It could be thought of, it could be that way. We spend our energy on understanding how the mergers behaved, but I guess that's another interpretation of what the contrast people might been doing. One thing to note is, regardless of whether you merge the contrast, we strongly feel that young Taiwanese speakers have strong feelings about China, and then they react to that. And it seems that the data that we have is sort of like reflecting that, it's aligning how they feel about China, and then the way how they produce the sounds. It seems to be aligning that way. Thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you so much. That looks like that's all our questions for you two. I'm gonna say thank you so much for your presentations. Good work. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your conference.
You too. Bye-bye. Take care. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You can leave.